why this presidency was erased from memory. Some presidencies are remembered for triumph, others for disaster. And then there are those that quietly vanish, not because nothing happened, but because nothing dramatic enough happened to survive collective memory. This was one of those presidencies. It governed. It decided. It influenced outcomes that still matter today, and yet it slowly disappeared from the national story, leaving behind only faint impressions and scattered references. The erasure did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, through neglect rather than denial. There was no scandal large enough to anchor it in textbooks, no war decisive enough to define it, no sweeping reform bold enough to claim ownership of an era. In a culture that remembers history through extremes, this presidency existed in the middle, and the middle is where memory fades fastest. At the time, the administration was viewed as competent but unremarkable. It inherited problems rather than creating them. It managed crises rather than redefining them. Decisions were made carefully, often conservatively, with an emphasis on stability over spectacle. That restraint helped the nation avoid immediate disaster, but also deprived the presidency of a clear narrative hook. Without visible drama, there was nothing for memory to grab onto. To understand why this presidency was erased, we need to understand how political memory works. History doesn't preserve effort. It preserves contrast. Leaders are remembered for what they break or what they build. Quiet maintenance rarely survives retelling, even when it prevents collapse. The absence of catastrophe is not easily celebrated because it requires imagining an alternative future that never happened. This presidency specialized in containment. It governed during a period when expectations were already low. Public trust was fragile. Institutions were strained. Any major move risked backlash. So the administration chose caution, not because it lacked vision, but because the environment punished ambition. Every action was weighed against the risk of destabilization, and stabilization became the implicit goal. That caution worked. Crises were narrowed instead of exploding. Institutions held. Markets remained functional. Daily life continued without major disruption. From a governance perspective, this was success. From a storytelling perspective, it was forgettable. The presidency prevented breakdown rather than delivering transformation, and prevention rarely earns lasting attention. The presidency also lacked a clear villain. There was no single enemy to define its purpose, no external threat to unify the public. Conflicts were diffuse, structural, and slow-moving. They did not lend themselves to dramatic framing. Without a clear antagonist, the administration's actions felt reactive rather than heroic. People struggled to remember stories without a central conflict, even when those stories mattered deeply. This made it difficult for supporters to champion and easy for critics to ignore. Over time, the presidency became associated with management rather than leadership. Decisions were correct, but cautious. Policies were incremental. Progress was slow. And while these traits reduced volatility, they also reduced memorability. Nothing stood out sharply enough to demand attention years later. The presidency blended into the background of continuity. Media played a decisive role in this erasure. Coverage focused on daily process rather than defining moments. Without major controversy, attention drifted. Headlines moved on quickly. Stories were replaced before they could settle into public consciousness. The presidency existed in a constant present tense, never quite becoming history while it was happening. Without a climactic arc, the narrative dissolved. By the time the term ended, there was no dominant image to carry forward, no single photograph, no defining speech, no moment of rupture or revelation. The presidency concluded not with resolution, but with transition. The nation moved on without pause and take stock of what had been held together. Closure never arrived, and without closure, memory thins. That transition sealed its fate. Subsequent events reframed the era retroactively. Later crises made earlier restraint look timid. Later boldness made earlier caution look irrelevant. The presidency was overshadowed by what followed, not because it failed, but because it did not compete for narrative space. History crowded it out with louder chapters. Historians often struggle with administrations like this. They are difficult to categorize. They do not fit cleanly into triumph or tragedy. Their influence is subtle, embedded in continuity rather than change. As a result, they are often reduced to footnotes, placeholders between more dramatic chapters. Their impact requires explanation rather than reaction. Yet the irony is that this presidency shaped the conditions that allowed later events to unfold. By preserving institutions, it passed forward a functioning system. By avoiding escalation, it deferred conflict rather than resolving it. By prioritizing stability, it allowed tensions to accumulate quietly. These choices mattered, but their consequences were delayed, making attribution difficult. Later leaders inherited both the stability and the unresolved strain. Memory favors immediacy. This presidency's impact arrived indirectly, through what it postponed rather than what it proclaimed. And postponed consequences are rarely credited to those who delayed them. Prevention does not leave fingerprints. It leaves absence, and absence is hard to honor. Another factor in its erasure was discomfort. The presidency did not fit comfortably into partisan narratives. Supporters found it uninspiring. Opponents found it unsatisfying to attack. Without strong emotional attachment on either side, it lacked defenders once it left office. Silence followed naturally, and silence accelerates forgetting. Political memory is sustained by advocacy. This presidency had little of it. Over time, its name appeared less frequently. References shortened. Context faded. New generations learned history through simplified arcs that skipped over periods of management in favor of periods of upheaval. The presidency became a gap between stories rather than the story itself, defined more by omission than by inclusion. And yet, its absence reveals something important. The erasure says less about failure than about how societies choose to remember power. We remember disruption more readily than restraint. We memorialize those who change direction, not those who keep systems running when they are close to breaking. Memory rewards noise. This presidency was erased because it refused spectacle. It operated in the shadow of larger forces, making choices designed to prevent worst outcomes rather than produce best ones. It absorbed pressure without converting it into drama, and in doing so, it denied history the sharp edges it prefers. It chose function over myth. The climax of the story is not a revelation, but a realization that forgetting can be a form of judgment, not a condemnation, but a dismissal, a decision to move past without reflection. The presidency becomes invisible not because it didn't matter, but because its kind of maturing is uncomfortable to confront. It forces us to ask whether quiet restraint deserves recognition, or whether only extremes define leadership. The resolution is subtle. As time passes, scholars return to eras like this with fresh eyes. Patterns emerge. Connections become clearer. The value of containment, delay, and institutional preservation becomes easier to see once distance removes emotional bias. What once felt dull begins to look deliberate. This presidency may never be celebrated, but it should not be erased. Because history is not only shaped by those who push events forward, but by those who hold them in place when movement would mean collapse. And when those presidencies vanish from memory, we lose the ability to recognize restraint as a form of leadership. The presidency was erased not because it failed. It was erased because it succeeded quietly. And quiet success rarely survives in a culture that remembers history by its noise.